Apart from the standard regular armed forces of China, the PLA, which included its ground forces or regular army, its strategic missile forces, its PLAN or Navy, as well as its PLAAF or Air Force, there was the gargantuan paramilitary arm of China with its multiple branches, with the most fanatical Praetorian Guard element of these forces being the People's Armed Police. Equipped with hand-me-down military weaponry, the PAP consisted of a number of elite light infantry type forces, which were effectively their standard units, with medium units that were equipped with hand-me-down track vehicles such as the Type 86G, or Guy for improved, and this IFV was heavily improved upon by the Chinese over the years and passed down to these paramilitary elements, as well as also XS Type 63 tracked armor personnel carriers, and Type 62G or Guy, or improved, light tanks. And these were very effective weapons with their high-velocity 105mm main gun, which was capable of firing a variety of different ammunition types, which could even defeat main battle tanks with the DU ammunition, the new and improved 105mm tungsten sabot ammunition, and ATGMs, which even gave these light tanks quite a range and capability. Although these were typically not utilized against enemy main battle tanks, they definitely had the capability to defeat should they enter any individual. The People's Armed Police also was equipped with artillery, typically in the lighter calibers such as 122mm and 130mm, such as these Type 83 towed howitzers, or the Type 59-I, which was a 130mm howitzer, which equipped some of the People's Armed Police forces, including those who were now currently fighting north of San Antonio within the scope of the Austin battle, fighting alongside other Russian forces who were part of the Russian Second Combined Arms Army. The very same force that had subunits fighting in the Fort Hood battle, as well as the Austin and San Antonio battles, having divvied up its forces between these main areas of focus. They were now, by this point in time, as it was now 7:30 a.m., in the phase of preparing to assault the Austin Bergstrom International Airport, utilizing their armored forces to do so, along with their mechanized infantry in the area as well. As they were preparing for this operation, the VVS, or Russian Air Force, Su-34 strike aircraft, which were extremely heavy-hitting aircraft, along with the PLAAF and their returning JF-17Bs, which were a 4.5 generation fighter jet, a bridge between 4th gen aircraft and 5th generation aircraft, with extremely capable weapon systems and avionics on board, now returning equipped with air-to-ground munitions, would assist the People's Armed Police forces on the ground, along with the combat drones operating in the area as well, and also a large number of loitering munitions, such as the Chinese CH-901As and the Russian Lancet 3s. As the Russian combat engineers had taken the state capital only a few hours prior, the combat was now shifting to prepare to clean up the entire Austin battle space. And with this effort, after capturing the Austin Bergstrom International Airport, the Serbian forces now pushing out of San Antonio and moving into N.Braunfels would effectively push a relatively mild-sized grouping of armed reactionary civilians into the waiting arms of the People's Armed Police Combat Forces in Austin, which would effectively annihilate them in battle at Creedmoor in the southernmost portion of the Austin battle space. In the meantime, as the Serbian forces of the 1st Brigade of the Serbian Army had dispatched their 5 battalions, which included their 2 artillery battalions of self-propelled Nora B 152mm howitzers, and also their Morava rocket battalion, which consisted of 122mm Morava rocket projectors, very similar to the Russian BM-21 Grad or the Chinese Type 83. As these were now moving to the north and slightly east along I-35, the artillery forces would stay back approximately 10 miles behind the armored battalion equipped with their Type 84 AS-2 main battle tanks, M84 AS-2 main battle tanks, which were a vastly upgraded version of the original platform, as this main battle tank had a brand new ballistic computer, fire control system, and was equipped with some of the newest ERA plating that the Serbians could produce. And as it had its 125mm main gun, it was fully capable of firing ATGMs, which gave it an extended range as a main battle tank. As the combat engineering forces were equipped with their VIU-55 combat engineering vehicles, or armored engineering vehicles, the Munja as it was called. These forces of the Combat Engineer Battalion were also equipped with the BVP M80, which was a multi-purpose armored fighting vehicle. It served as both an IFV and an APC for the Serbian forces, which also equipped their mechanized infantry, as these boasted a 20mm main gun, a new combat module, as well as also 2 pods for AT-3 anti-tank guided missiles, ATGMs. As these forces were now, all 5 battalions, pushing along I-35, their headquarters battalion over the entire brigade, with its logistical elements within it, its logistical companies, would support this operation with massive logistical trucking up I-35 to bring it to the combat units fighting just to the northeast, approximately 30 miles away, as they now entered the very southwestmost portion of N.Braunfels. They would be assisted by PLAAF aircraft, as well as also ISR capabilities from the PLA in the form of one of their armed high-altitude CH-4As, which would now be moving along with the Serbian forces to the northeast and out of the primary battle space, and would relay all the relevant information to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system back to the special troops within the HHB, or Headquarters of Headquarters Battalion of the 91st Headquarters Brigade, who would then by radio with artificial intelligence translations relay the information to the frontline Serbian combat units, telling them where enemy forces were at all times and where and how to move, and preparing pre-prepared strike packages for their artillery, both their howitzer artillery and their 122mm Morava rocket systems. As the aircraft would also be guided, as always, by the same system, as the Chinese had direct access, as it was their system, and also the Russians. They would be providing heavy air support as the JH-7 squadrons, which there were 2, as well as the J-11 squadron, and also the J-16 squadron returning with air-to-ground munitions, as it looked very much like a J-11, but it was actually a 4.5 generation fighter that had a shortened airframe and was a completely different aircraft from the J-11, but was even more capable than the already quite advanced J-11 was, and split between assisting the Russian Spetsnaz forces, as there were 2 companies of Spetsnaz troops that were now within the Government Canyon State Park, conducting their long-range reconnaissance and patrol operations, which effectively also was a search and destroy operation effectively, as during their long-range reconnaissance and patrols, reconning with their quadcopter assets, they would be able to call in heavy artillery strikes from their own artillery forces from the 30th Motor Rifle Brigade's Howitzer Battalion, consisting of the self-propelled 2S-19 MSTA 152mm howitzers, as well as PLAAF airstrikes, and of course, strikes from the VVS attack helo gunships, which consisted of the Mi-35M transport/attack helos, with their 80mm S-8 rockets, as well as their Ataka ATGMs, or they could also, in place of the Ataka, be equipped with the Storm ATGM, but they were now equipped with the Atakas and their 23mm nose cannons, which effectively cleared the way, along with the heavy firepower and tactical prowess of the Spetsnaz troops themselves, throughout the canyon as they gradually patrolled for 2 full days, even camping out for a night in the canyon during this long-range recon and patrol, both companies, as they would again be reconning the area for enemy forces using their quadcopter assets and the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, guiding them into skirmishes with enemy forces, as well as preparing the strike packages of artillery, airstrikes, and even guiding the attack helo gunships on where enemy forces were, as much as it was guiding the ground troops and directing their fire, which even included FPV drones, such as this Spetsnaz soldier operating one in combat, sending it to destroy a grouping of armed reactionary civilian elements operating in the area. As all of this heavy firepower was being laid down in the Government Canyon, the Serbian forces were bringing their heavy firepower into N.Braunfels as they moved 30 miles up the highway into the area, and now were reaching the southwestmost end of the city of N.Braunfels. As again, it was now 7:30. They had already started their movements an hour prior at 6:30 a.m. as they moved up the highway. The logistical elements of the brigade headquarters battalion would again be gradually trucking up ammunition, whether it was shells to small arms ammunition to rocket artillery ammunition to tank ammunition, as in the 125mm tank shells of various types, as well as fuel and medical supplies and more, and food. As this steady stream of logistics moved up the highway by truck to support their troops, the armored battalion, as the strategy for clearing N.Braunfels, which was along a node along I-35, called for the combat engineer battalion to swing in from the south, and the mechanized infantry battalion, one of a handful within the 1st Army Brigade tasked with moving into N.Braunfels, would swing to the north, and the combat engineers would push any armed reactionary civilian elements into the downtown area, which was north of I-35 as it ran through N.Braunfels. Effectively, they would swing out a bit further while the armored battalion would move up and clear the highway after the combat engineers had effectively fought their way into squeezing armed reactionary civilians into the downtown area, with the mechanized infantry battalion closing off the escapes from the north. As again, this area was downtown, and it lay to the north of I-35 as it meandered its way through the city. And as a result, the armored battalion could concentrate its full force on moving up the entire duration of I-35 on either side, clearing the area. So when the battle officially began, it began with a company of tanks and a company of armored infantry intermixed in this area, with the different combat platoons operating in this area of the southwestmost end of the city, wherein the headquarters platoons of each company sat further back and away from the main combat, as the Chinese provided the ISR capabilities and also some ATGM support of their own, firing HJ-10 anti-tank missiles at this grouping of vehicles trying to hurry up the highway and out of the area as soon as Serbians had been spotted by other armed civilians or non-combatants who were passing through the area on ordinary movements. They spread word throughout the area rather quickly as the word spread that the Serbs had arrived, although they didn't know that these were Serbian forces right away and had mistaken them for Russians. They were now either trying to group up together and come up with a plan of defense, like was being done at the sports complex that was located in this part of the city. There was also even a reptile zoo in this area as well. There were hotels, there were other commercial sites, gas stations, there was an automotive repair garage, motels and hotels, housing neighborhoods in this area, especially near the sports complex. And the highway ran through this area. There were some hotels in this area as well, one with a pool, and there were some nicer homes here on the outskirts of the city. Again, this is the southwesternmost end of New Braunfels. In this area, this is a 2-mile east-west by 1 mile north-south in terms of scale. There are wooded areas on the edge of the city, of course, and fields, as between New Braunfels and San Antonio was effectively 30 miles of small towns as well as open fields, as there were in the area ranches. And as a result, this gave the Serbian forces the maneuver space they needed to get their armored forces in place, as by the end of the combat on this particular map, one of the other tank companies, as there were 4, would be moving into this area after these 2 companies, 1 tank and 1 armored infantry, would secure this entire portion of the town first before gathering all of their battalion to sweep the rest of the city, giving the combat engineer battalion time to move in from the south and fight their way into cornering all the armed reactionary civilians in downtown to get them away from the highway so that the armored forces could easily clear the area, which was the strategy within the scope of this particular action, this combat action over New Braunfels. The rocket strikes from the Morava Rocket Battalion would be savage and hellaciously destructive, as this entire area would be spotted with the movement by the Chinese CH-4A high-altitude recon drone as it basically made its entire circuit around the entire city, which also included this area, which was the downtown area. And again, downtown in New Braunfels is located to the north of the highway, as the strategy was for the Mechanized Infantry Battalion and the Combat Engineer Battalion to move north and south, respectively, as the combat engineers were coming in from the south and the mechanized infantry was coming in from the north. The combat engineers were to push ahead of the armored battalion, who would then sweep the area after they had moved through and fought the armed reactionary civilians into a situation where they were cornered as they would go through all the city blocks. Many would be hit heavily by artillery and even airstrikes, as again, the Chinese PLAAF forces that were allocated for the San Antonio battle space were now split between supporting the Russian Spetsnaz forces in Government Canyon and this Serbian assault to clear the highway along New Braunfels, as New Braunfels was a medium-sized city of over 100,000 people, making it a secondary node, as the primary battle space of San Antonio was now fully cleared for the incoming external invasion prong of PLA Group Armies 7 through 13, as they would now no longer have to worry about stopping to engage hostile forces along the highway, as the Russian 2nd Combined Arms Army and its constituent forces, as well as also their allies that were under their command, like the 13th Infantry Brigade of the Venezuelan Army, the Volunteer Nicaraguan Combat Battalion, put together out of volunteers from the Nicaraguan Army, as well as also the Serbian 1st Army Brigade, which was now moving out of the area and into a secondary area, which was New Braunfels. And this battle would effectively consist mostly of combat within the southwesternmost end, which was this particular area of New Braunfels, as well as also in downtown. These would be the main areas where combat would be seen by these Serbian forces, who were much more heavily equipped and much better supported, of course, than the armed reactionary civilians who primarily had small arms, and a few of them had Molotovs but wouldn't be able to utilize them, and thus would be completely annihilated by Serbian artillery, Chinese airstrikes, and even ATGM strikes coming in from the CH-4A high-altitude reconnaissance drone platform at the very opening of this map, firing HJ-10s and destroying this small convoy of technicals, which were effectively pickup trucks with armed men inside, or SUVs in some cases. As these vehicles were moving through the area, howitzer artillery from the Nora B Battalion was called in as the FDC forces of the Serbian artillery battalions, both their howitzer and rocket battalions, would get the pre-prepared strike packages radioed through to them from the Russian 91st Headquarters Brigade and overall command of the entire 2nd Combined Arms Army and its operations. Within the headquarters of headquarters, there were the special troops who conducted the relay operations for all the information from the real-time AI battlefield data processing system that the Russians and Chinese had direct access to, as they could act as dispatchers and dispatch to all their allies who did not have combat data link technologies to be grafted into this system, at least the basic hardware to do so, and thus they had to rely on radio relay communications instead of having it sent directly to a combat data link. And this also included the Serbian forces, who were not quite as far in these ancillary but extremely important technologies as the Russians, Chinese, and a few of the other allies were, like Iran, who were further along, as well as even the Pakistanis, than were the smaller Tier 3 power nations like Venezuela, Serbia, which was borderline between being a Tier 3 and Tier 2 power. The only reason why they were not a Tier 2 power is because their military was relatively small, and although they had capabilities of developing not just small arms, but also very capable heavy weapons, they were still considered a Tier 3 power. But they were getting better and better equipped, including with Chinese air defense systems like the HQ-22 that had been sold to them, as well as also technical advisors from both Russia and China working to assist them in developing even newer technologies. And in the case of the fighting that was occurring now within New Braunfels, just these two companies alone from the Armored Battalion, which consisted of these tank platoons intermixed with these armored infantry platoons for direct armored infantry and armor support, mutual support between these forces, and also down here as well. This was the 3rd combat platoon of the tank company that is pictured in this area, moving in from the west, and this is the 3rd combat platoon of the 3 combat platoons of the armored infantry company, also moving in from the west. As again, the other tank company that would move in at the very end of this map would be moving up this street here, as they were moving in from the slight southwest, and the other companies, which included a 3rd and 4th tank company and a 2nd armored infantry company, an anti-tank company, and their headquarters company, which was their headquarters and support company, their command and logistical elements over the entire armored battalion, would be moving in last to support their main combat forces and their drive into the city to clear everything along I-35, as that was their primary directive in this operation, and they were carrying this out relatively quickly. As the battle opened up, the tanks were firing very powerful salvos of Frag-T tank shells, HE shells, as well as heat shells, which were more than enough to annihilate these technicals and buildings such as this nice home in this area, which had been completely destroyed by tank shells as the tanks were firing into this area trying to hit these moving vehicles as they moved up and down the street. And they were able to not only destroy the vehicles, but some of the fire destroyed the house as well. The IFV/APCs, which were the BVP M80s, were firing their 20mm main guns, as well as also their AT-3 ATGMs, as some of the ATGMs would also hit other targets in this area as well, like these two technicals. Artillery would come in and decimate this wooded area, as movement had been sighted as this drone was encircling the entire city on a circuit, just effectively flying around and watching everything as it developed on the ground, and thus again connected to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, sending all the relevant ISR information back through the AI to the Russians, who then relayed it by radio, since there were no combat data links for them to be connected directly to it, to these forces by radio, directing them where to move, when to move, what to fire, what was safe to fire for their own forces, and how to maximize the effect of their firepower, which also included the pre-prepared artillery strike missions, which decimated this entire city block as 122mm Morava rockets came in from the rocket battalion and showered this area, including 40 personnel that were inside of this hotel, which was separated by a fence from the automotive repair garage area, which also got hit by rocket strikes as rockets showered this entire area, this gas station, these businesses, hotel. All of it was annihilated, including these vehicles that were trying to speed down the access road at the time the rockets started coming in. And as all of this was happening, these vehicles were destroyed on the periphery of this rocketing, as there were other rocket companies within the battalion. Another rocket company was firing into this area, which also, again, had been spotted here at the sports complex that was located in this corner of N.Braunfels, in the southwestmost corner. If one were to look at a map, they would see the sports complex. There's a church nearby. There's homes. Again, hotels, businesses, there's even a reptile zoo, and all of it was being hit heavily by howitzer artillery on the edge of the zoo here, and rocket artillery in this particular area, and in the sports complex as well. Even the dugouts here in the baseball diamond got relatively damaged, and by stray rockets hitting a bit further out, as the rockets had a bit of a spread to them. Even some of the houses here on the periphery were completely wiped out. The church was horribly gutted. All of these forces were, though, completely wiped out by the rocket fire. It was very heavy, and it showered this entire area with 122mm rocket fire, completely destroying all these technicals and personnel, as this was devastating, as this vehicle had reached this point by the time the rocket fire came in, as these are imminent strike markers. This vehicle got to this point, as did this vehicle here, by the time the rockets came in and finished them off. At the opening of this map, these vehicles are speeding down the street. KD-88s had been fired by this J-11 much, much further away and off this map. They'd been fired from miles away, as they actually have an over 100-mile range. They're an air-to-ground standoff cruise missile, and these two hit these technicals and destroyed these homes on this city block at the opening of the map. As also in this area, there's a pair of JH-7s, and one is using its twin 23mm nose cannon to strafe these vehicles as they drive down the street, as it's pointed slightly downward and strafes the vehicles and completely shreds them to absolute scrap. And the artillery again came in and wiped all of these vehicles out as they moved up this access road. Again, not doing any damage to the highway because that was important. Only certain weaponry could be used against highway targets, such as ATGMs or also loitering munitions when available, although the Serbians did not have any loitering munitions, and the nearest Russian forces were a bit far away to use loitering munitions in support, although they could have. The loitering munitions wouldn't be able to loiter over the battlefield for very long, having to travel just over 30 miles to reach the lines of contact now developing in the city of N.Braunfels. Although the artillery strikes were more than enough to deal immense damage to these forces, howitzer artillery also destroyed this office building and these nicer homes here on the edge of the city, as these vehicles and these personnel moved out of the city block that this zoo was on and were completely engulfed in artillery fire. 152mm shelling from the Nora B howitzer battalion of the Serbian Army's 1st Brigade, which also allowed for the armor to move in as these tanks moved in one at a time. They were accompanied again by their armored infantry forces of one of two armored infantry companies of the tank battalion, who followed them effectively into the area after, again, sitting on the outskirts and firing across the fields and wooded areas to destroy targets before moving in, using their range advantage of their weapons to hit the armed reactionary civilians before they had even known what hit them. All the howitzer fire that came in here gutted this hotel effectively in the front, and the armored infantry forces of the Serbian armored infantry platoon of the one of two armored infantry companies of the battalion was gradually moving into the area and would dismount all four of its companies, as these platoons of the Serbian forces were made up of 4 vehicles apiece instead of 5, as they had smaller platoon sizes than Russians and Chinese. They would send their squads in effectively to clear these buildings while leaving vehicles outside in a column of 4 vehicles with staggered weapons watching the area after the artillery had already decimated these forces, as effectively they were moving in to clear whatever was left in these hotels. There were originally 50 in this hotel, and there were 17 in this hotel, but this hotel had lost some of the personnel inside when the artillery strikes came in and horribly gutted the building, so effectively they had easy entry into the now cascading rubble that actually cascaded out into the street slightly from the shelling earlier, and now they went in, sending 2 squads in to clear the hotel, and they had 1 squad in between these hotels while this squad went in to clear this one, and ultimately exited the building out in the pool area and watched and scanned the area, as they also had this tank platoon gradually moving through the parking area and sitting outside by the time they all reached here. As they moved in gradually, they were scanning their sectors of fire the whole time they would move. They would pause for a moment, wait for their armored infantry forces to move before they would move again. All of this was choreographed by the AI, directing these forces where to move so they could all provide outstanding mutual support with different sectors of fire, watching different areas, as again, they were watching for movement. Anywhere there was movement, the AI, real-time artificial intelligence battlefield data processing system, would put together strike packages for the artillery, like so, here as well, and also direct the tanks and armored infantry forces where to move and where to fire. And as they found these movements, even they would use their ATGMs against highway targets, as they could carry 16 ATGMs or even dropped air-to-ground munitions from these CH-4As. They had slots for 16 weapons apiece, which was quite large for an armed recon drone, even more than some of the cheaper and widely mass-produced actual combat drones. But this recon drone fired and destroyed these forces while directing the Serbian armor and armored infantry exactly where to move. Earlier on in the fighting, as there's a lot going on in this map, it's difficult to cover in order, but it will be attempted as always. When these forces were opening fire on forces that were seen on the edge of the city, they would also be choreographed in their movements at the same time as these forces were moving in. They were all making a gradual move into this section of the city, as the 20 millimeter fire, AT-3 ATGM fires, including into this wooded area, with also 125 millimeter fire, 12.7 millimeter fire from turret machine gunners, as well as also coax fire, which was 7.62 by 54 millimeter, a general purpose round, effectively. They cut these forces down quickly as they moved into this section of the city to secure the highway, as they were gradually clearing it according to the overall strategy of clearing N.Braunfels, making a way along this very vital key strategic invasion route for the external forces, making sure that there were no hostile elements immediately adjacent to the highway, making it seamless and easy for the external forces to move through. That was vitally important, because the externals, according to the 4th generation warfare doctrine, should not ever have to stop for anything except logistics. They should never have to get off the highway to engage, because of time. And the entire 4th gen doctrine was about crippling speed, paralyzing speed. It was not about anything else, but using the Trojans not only as a means by which to keep the externals supplied by having actual CCP regime properties, which were effectively gas stations and logistical posts for these external forces moving up these highways, but also to clear the areas, mainly the urban areas and large towns along these highways, to make it as clear as possible for the externals to move through without having to stop and waste time and engage hostile forces. That was the job of the Trojans. That was the whole point. As they were now moving into the area, this platoon had moved through here after these forces had been shelled, after these forces had been dealt total destruction. These homes were destroyed. They moved through this area, came around the corner, while this platoon and this tank platoon effectively merged and got in a single column formation and moved through the area as well with this armored infantry platoon. So there were 3 platoons now moving through the area, 1 armored infantry, which should go out a bit further and come through this area, and the 2 platoons, 1 tank and 1 armored infantry, who would move under the underpass and move this direction and secure this area as all the vehicles would be in a line. And the same thing over here. They would effectively be doing a BDA of this area because everything had been destroyed by all the rocket fire from the Morava rocket battery that fired into this area and destroyed everything. They would effectively sit in this area and basically hold down the area while the rest of their battalion moved into the city. The last movements was another of the tank companies moving into this portion of the map, which was a residential area in this particular corner of N.Braunfels. And as they now had secured this area of N.Braunfels, and the rocketing and shelling had decimated many of the armed reactionary civilian elements, as these forces cleared what remained of the 50 that were in this hotel, they then emerged and fired on the forces in this hotel. They briefly exchanged fire and then went in to clear it from the front and the back door and went in and began going room to room, hallway to hallway, office to office throughout this hotel, getting rid of the remaining armed reactionary civilians, taking a few prisoner as well, as they had done here, and they sent them out to their vehicle-based forces to effectively guard them while they continue clearing these buildings. This squad held their position out here, scanned their sector of fire through this direction here and here. They were supported by the armor from this platoon that moved through this area to scan other sectors of fire, like also supporting their forces here, which also mutually supported them, and also watching the buildings as this tank sat here. This individual tank from this platoon here moved into the area and sat here and watched these hotels, while also the armored infantry who were lined up were watching the area as well, staggered weapons, tactically. Now that these areas had been cleared, these forces were spotted escaping, but they were escaping into the arms of the Combat Engineer Battalion, who was already moving north and through the city as they were clearing their areas. And the Mechanized Infantry Battalion was moving south, coming in from the north, as again, combat engineers would swing out and move north into the city. The mechanized infantry would swing from the north and cover that area of the city, while the armor would sweep all the way up I-35 after all the armed reactionary civilians in this area had effectively been destroyed, and the rest would have been cornered to the north and downtown. As the strategy was coming together beautifully, the artillery and decimation from the air, as these very heavy-hitting strike aircraft, these JH-7s, as well as now the armed with air-to-ground munition J-11 aircraft, as well as the J-16 aircraft, would come in and drop or fire air-to-ground weapons on these personnel, along with heavy artillery shelling and rocketing, as well as all the ground-based fire coming in from the combat engineer forces, and in the north, the mechanized infantry forces who would move in and do their part to surround and help eliminate the remaining armed reactionary civilian threat within N.Braunfels. Again, the ISR assets connected to the real-time AI battlefield data processing system monitored everything. All the movement seen in the city was instantaneously processed by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system within milliseconds, and pre-made strike packages for artillery, for the aircraft, were put together near instantaneously by the second, as data was processed by the millisecond, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system was able to process multiple domains of data within milliseconds and put together pre-prepared strike packages in seconds, and also show by the literal second where friendly and enemy units were at all times for the ground-based forces, such as maneuver elements who were actually engaging in direct combat, as well as also, again, putting together the strike packages for the FDCs to pass down to the gun lines for the artillery forces, and pre-prepared airstrikes for the air-based forces, even missile strikes, as there were cruise and tactical ballistic missile strikes in certain areas as well. As in this particular instance, however, this was strictly mostly a Serbian operation in terms of the ground-based forces, as it was only Serbian combat forces on the ground conducting the operation as a whole, although they were heavily supported by the PLAAF as well as the PLA's ISR capabilities. The Serbians were effectively fighting this one alone in terms of the combat on the ground in N.Braunfels as a ground force, as the Russians would not be fighting in this city, nor would they join the Serbian forces as they moved into Kyle, but the combat in Kyle would almost be non-existent. It would consist of very tiny skirmishes with very small groups of armed reactionary civilians, as the only armed reactionary civilians that managed to get out of N.Braunfels before the combat engineers swung in from the north and the armor began to clear the area, as the downtown area would effectively become a death trap. It would become a kill box for these armed reactionary civilians. The rest that managed to get out of the city would move into Kyle, warn people in Kyle, and thus they would all move further to the north into the Austin battle space, at where they would be engaged and destroyed by the People's Armed Police that would encounter them and be sent in to deal with them via the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, as they would also have air support from their JF-17Bs, as well as combat drone support, ample loitering munitions support, as well as also Russian air support from their VVS and their very heavy-hitting Su-34 strike aircraft, as well as Russian artillery, in addition to their own 152mm, as the PAP's artillery of 130mm would also be joined by the even heavier 152mm shelling, as all the loitering munitions, the ground-based fires, the air power, combat drones, and loitering munitions would all simply be too much for the armed reactionary civilians that were being pushed into that area to even be able to deal with, as they fled the vengeful Serbs, who were effectively on a punitive operation of sorts, as they never forgot 1999 and everything that came before that, as their nation was dismantled, and they blamed it all not just on America, but effectively the entire collective West in general. But America, as they were part of the coalition, was the nation suffering the most, as now the Serbians and other nations involved all now had their opportunity to take revenge, and they were doing so as effective members of this coalition, although the Foreign Expeditionary Army, as it was called, was drastically smaller than the Chinese or even the Russian forces that were partaking in this invasion. It was still relatively sizable, with 500,000 troops from different nation-states that were part of that section of the coalition forces. But again, the Chinese contributing 10 million of their armed forces, its active, reserve, and ready reserve forces that were all mobilized for this, as well as also the Russians contributing their 2 million, were by far the coalition leaders. But the small Serbian component was fighting very effectively, as they were guided by the real-time AI battlefield data processing system, which was a Sino-Russian AI system, and also the massive ISR capabilities of both the Chinese and Russians as they combined them for this invasion, which the Chinese alone were already gargantuan, but heaping the Russians on top and even smaller capabilities from other allies like Iran and Pakistan just made it all the more worse for the Americans as this invasion dragged on. It would only be a 4-day invasion, the fastest of its kind ever seen, and the largest but it would be highly hellaciously devastating on this nation. And the Serbian forces played their part to the letter, as now they had cleared a 2-mile by 1-mile portion of New Braunfels in its far southwestmost corner along the highway, the key invasion route, perhaps the most vital of the invasion routes within the south central invasion sector, primarily which was Texas, but also Oklahoma and New Mexico, as the external invasion prong of 7 through 13 in terms of PLA group armies would be passing through the area in short order, and the Serbian forces wanted to be able to show their allies how effective they could be, and they were fighting very effectively in this sector. And now that they had gotten their foothold inside of the city, as the last movement was this tank company coming into this one area of the city, with the other companies, of course, to the north and south of this area, preparing now to move and clear the entire area along I-35 itself, as they were waiting for the combat engineers to push north and effectively fight their way into downtown to move all the threats away from I-35 so that the armored forces could seamlessly clear the area. That was the grand strategy involved in the New Braunfels battle. And again, there would only be 2 major areas of combat in this battle, which was downtown and the far southwestmost corner, as the rest of the armed civilians that managed to escape were hurriedly fleeing towards Kyle and would warn others who would again flee into the arms of the savage People's Armed Police combat forces waiting for them in Creedmoor, as they would be directed to move into that area to engage and destroy them. 1,000 strong armed reactionary civilians would end up making it to Creedmoor, but they would not make it out with their lives. More to come in the next video installation of the San Antonio battle within the scope of this hypothetical invasion documentary series highlighting 4th-generation warfare doctrines through a Sino-Russian coalition invasion, as the fighting in San Antonio had effectively concluded, although again, the long-range reconnaissance and patrol operation being carried out by the Spetsnaz forces would go on for 2 days. But the entire city and the highway segments that passed through it were now fully under coalition control, and the external components could pass through undisturbed en route to their final destinations. And now the Serbian forces had expanded the coalition control into a secondary area, which included a segment of I-35 that stretched between San Antonio and Austin battle spaces. And the Serbian 1st Army Brigade would prove itself in the combat, as it already was doing so in New Braunfels, and would move on to Kyle once they had fully taken control of downtown with their Combat Engineer Battalion and Mechanized Infantry Battalion, now fighting in this area to wipe out the remaining armed reactionary civilians who had found themselves trapped there, as the real-time AI battlefield data processing system directed all the movements of these forces, and the Americans lacked any ISR or communications, and thus never even fully understood that they had been surrounded until it was too late, until they found combat engineers to their general south and mechanized infantry to their north, moving in to trap them, as there was a river that separated downtown from the other areas of the city to the north. They would be hit by air artillery strikes and rocket artillery strikes as well, and also the ground-based forces moving in to effectively encircle and clear them from this area. As the fighting in downtown would be relatively savage, it will be gone over in the next installation, the final part of this sub-series within the San Antonio battle, which has the New Braunfels combat operation highlighted, as this was effectively the last real combat operation involving forces from the San Antonio battle, as This secondary area was being cleared by the Serbian forces. As the combat engineers were pushing into this area, along with the mechanized infantry, the armored battalion now had free rein to clear the entire I-35 area adjacent to both sides of I-35. The downtown fighting will be going over in the next installation, as following the San Antonio battle will be the Battle of Dallas-Fort Worth, a massive operation within the scope of this particular sector of the nationwide invasion. More to come.